Hello and welcome to the CVL podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we'll be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is the CVL podcast. In this episode, we meet with Dr. Clayton Curtis, a professor at New York University's Department of Psychology and Center for Neuroscience. He received his MA and PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota, and his research focuses on the neural mechanisms that support spatial cognition. Dr. Curtis and his team at NYU are exploring how our brains help us understand and interact with the world around us, particularly in terms of spatial awareness and cognitive control. His research includes topics like working memory, attention, and motor control. Cognitive control refers to our ability to plan, make decisions, and adapt our behavior based on our goals and surroundings. We also discuss spatial awareness, which is our ability to understand where we are in relation to our surroundings and other objects. To study these topics, Dr. Curtis's lab uses a variety of imaging techniques to study the brain in both healthy populations and those with neurological conditions. These include fMRI scans to map brain activity during cognitive tasks, eye tracking, which involves tracking minute eye movements to better understand what people are paying attention to and how they process visual information. And he also uses something called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a non-invasive brain stimulation method where magnetic pulses are applied just above the head to temporarily activate or inhibit specific brain areas. This allows researchers to study how these regions are involved in different cognitive processes. His lab also uses computational modeling to create mathematical models that simulate and predict neural processes. The key brain regions that we will be discussing in this episode include the prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex, and the primary visual cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that lies just behind the forehead, and it's implicated in higher cognitive functions like problem solving, decision making, and cognitive control. The parietal cortex is a little further back towards the middle of the head, kind of where you would rest your sunglasses on your head. And the visual cortex is right at the back of the head, and this is where information coming in through the eyes first arrives. Dr. Curtis and his team are trying to better understand how our brains control our thoughts and actions. His research has implications for leading to better treatments to conditions like ADHD, schizophrenia, or stroke, where problems with cognitive control can severely impact daily life. So join us as we learn more about how the brain represents the space around us and some of the cognitive abilities that make us uniquely human.
Dr. Curtis, thank you so much for taking the time to have a conversation with us today. I wanted to start off by learning a little bit about your background and what led you to the area of research that you do.
Well, it's my pleasure to join you. My background, I started with an interest in science even when I was a kid. I ended up doing my bachelor's at the University of Texas at Austin, and there I studied psychology and biology, but I was really got interested in studying schizophrenia. So I worked on some projects that were trying to understand the pathophysiology of schizophrenia. And then that led me to a doctorate program that I joined at the University of Minnesota, the Twin Cities. And I continued to study both aspects of schizophrenia pathophysiology, but also getting into genetic risk factors. And so some of the work I did was on healthy but relatives of people with schizophrenia. That was really fascinating. And that's where I first began to do some brain imaging studies while I was there. And then I had a hard decision to make. I was trying to decide whether I continue on this path or go to medical school. So there was a when I was, I guess, in an undergraduate, I was planning to go to medical school. Then I got kind of interested in this research. And then after doing my PhD, I was like, maybe I should go to medical school. But I did not. I decided that I got interested in neuroimaging, and I said, okay, if I'm going to do neuroimaging, I want to do it well. And so I began to look at labs to do a postdoc where I could become expert at that technique and worry less about whether or not it's being applied to schizophrenia, with the idea that someday I would get back to doing some work with schizophrenia. And luckily, in the last few years, I've, even though most of my work is basic science, I have collaborations that are with labs at Columbia and Yale that study schizophrenia, that do neuroimaging, and so that's how I get my kind of fix that way.
So you're still kind of involved in the schizophrenia research.
Yes,
in a way.
and I would like to get even more involved. It's just finding the time.
Yep.
So, Dr. Curtis, your research focuses on something called spatial cognition. Could you explain to our listeners what spatial cognition is?
Right. It's just basically a umbrella term for any cognitive ability that we use spatial representations for. So these could be maintain some spatial representation in your mind to help you think better, to help guide your motor behaviors. Examples that people probably know about include attention. So often you may be, let's say you're attending to a doorway because you expect a friend to come in. So that's an example of spatial attention. Also, I study spatial working memory too, so you're remembering where things are. So, I don't know, you're sorting your socks in your laundry and you remember, okay, there was a pink sock over there. So I have a spatial representation of where that is. And also, I also study the kind of the output of spatial representations, including how we orient to information in our world. Like the thing that I most study is saccades. These are rapid eye movements that we make many hundreds of thousands a day. And those involve just making an eye movement to something that's behaviorally relevant, and that's a spatial location.
So those saccades are like those little tiny eye movements are really, really quick, right?
Yeah, or even larger ones.
Larger
if you look
ones
for
as well.
one they're kind of ballistic, fast eye movements. Now the one other thing I'll say about space that's kind of interesting, I find there's something kind of beautiful about the way that the brain represents space, because it involves things that I like geometry, and there's topological representations that look like maps. So besides that, I also find it useful. It's a feature. Space is a feature that can be really exploited really well in kind of neuroimaging studies, computational analytics, and computational modeling. Space is a really nice feature to work in. Yeah. It's interpretable, very interpretable.
Right. One thing that I'm kind of curious about, so it's been kind of like a considerable area of research and debate, sex differences in spatial cognition. So, for example, in spatial thinking, specifically tasks that involve mental rotation or navigation. Have you ever looked into that? Like, do you know anything about whether we're seeing these sex differences in spatial cognition?
Yeah, I've heard exactly what you've said. I do believe there are some differences that exist that are reliable. I don't think anyone knows why. And so it's kind of a mystery why. I've heard speculation, like some of the speculation has to do with that, in real, I guess, real gross terms, there might be differences between the way that a female's brain is organized and a male's brain. But personally, I don't know. I've never really studied this before. But it's fascinating.
It is.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
You have to worry about, if I was doing this research, I would worry about factors that might be confounding these measures. So what kind of educational experiences may be differing, things like that would be something I would really...
That whole nature versus nurture thing comes into it
yes,
too, right?
yeah.
What kind of exposure are people giving girls versus boys to different types of scenarios?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm thinking.
So your research also focuses on working memory. Could you describe what this is and how it relates to higher level cognition?
Right. Working memory, one part of it we understand really well. It's basically our short-term memory. That part is referred to as the storage component of working memory. But working memory is a dual component system. Not only does it involve storage, but it involves control operations. These are the operations that we perform on the contents of our memory. So the brain doesn't just store things just to store things. The reason why we have short-term memory or working memory is because by being able to keep something in an active state for a bit of time, it opens up a whole range of new abilities. So, the world's changing so quickly around us. Being able to store something for a brief period of time really helps a lot. Now, that storage system also has a hallmark feature, which is it's very capacity limited. So you can only really remember with good precision 3, 4, 5 things in your mind, and then you start to lose the quality of that memory representation. And so the control part is also interesting as well, because if you this idea that you're supposed to be working with your memory, that's the working part. Again, we don't store things just for no reason. We store them because we're going to use them. So if you're doing, for example, math, in your head, which no one likes to do, you're given a few numbers and you have to add them up. Storing those numbers is one thing, but then the process of addition, you're acting on the contents of your memory, and that's an example of the control process.
So working memory is like you're basically also you're working with that material.
Yes.
Because I know there's like sometimes confusion between working memory and short-term memory.
Yes.
People kind of interchange the two. So short-term memory is kind of like a component of working memory.
Right. So working memory is dual component, and it's the short-term memory plus the control operations.
So you're kind of able to manipulate that information.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So your research has also looked at the neural activity in the brain that relates to working memory. Where did you see this activity, and how did you find it?
Yeah, so there's been a long history of studying how the brain represents information in working memory. I have been mostly focused on the last couple of decades using functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a technique that allows you to measure changes in oxygenation of the blood, and that correlates with activity of neurons. So if there's part of your brain, the neurons in part of your brain are active because you're remembering something, we can infer that by looking at the fMRI bold signal. And the parts of the brain that we typically see that are critical for working memory seem to be areas that are involved in, again, the storage component, and those are more associated with areas in the back of your brain that are associated with sensory mechanisms. So if I'm trying to remember an object, some feature of an object, I'm probably going to be using this part of my brain that's in the visual cortex to remember that object. That's the storage part. However, the control part, we typically see activity in the parts of the prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex. And we think this forms a network for working memory. They have to interact with one another. For example, your perceptual system, like your visual cortex, isn't really good at memory. It needs the input from the prefrontal and or parietal cortex to keep things in memory. It needs to be told, yes, keep on representing that stimulus.
So it's kind of like the coach telling
yes.
the player, you got to be doing this.
Yes, it's the director.
Yeah. So could you discuss the relationship between working memory and attention? How do they interact in the brain, and where are these shared activities happening?
Right. On the one hand, attention and working memory are not necessarily the same thing. So, for example, you can attend to something like the doorway where your friend might come in, and that doesn't necessarily involve memory. So in that sense, they can be dissociated or different. On the other hand, you can think of working memory like attention that's directed inward instead of outward. So if I'm directing my attention to that doorway, that's outward. but doesn't really involve memory. But if I'm directing my attention to something that's an active representation in my brain, then that starts to look a lot like the short-term memory. So you're attending to this internal representation. So in that sense, they kind of overlap. And in fact, when you do studies of like, let's say, working memory and attention, especially in certain domains, like when you're remembering or attending to space, you see that the parts of the brain that are active are highly overlapping. And in addition, we published a paper years ago where we used the patterns of brain activity in frontal and parietal cortex while someone's, let's say, attending to a location to the left. And once we calculated those patterns, we could use those patterns to predict with other data while a subject's remembering something to the left. And those two patterns were almost interchangeable because their ability to cross-predict attention and working memory was very successful. And so in this case, because the patterns are so interchangeable, you could imagine that they are very similar, especially some of their mechanisms are likely to be very similar and overlap.
So because they're so similar and they're sharing similar, mechanisms, like you said, if we, for example, improve our focus so our attention gets better, does that mean our working memory also gets better?
Yeah, we think so. Now, it depends on what you mean. If you mean if I improve my attention, then my working memory on a time scale of days to months or years isn't better. That's not clear. But if you're talking about on an immediate time scale, if you focus your attention, your memory will be better. And so in that case, they're related. And so I think it depends on the time scale.
That makes sense. I feel that's kind of like intuitive, but I think your work is finally helping us see that in the brain happening, these activities of working memory and attention working together. Yeah.
And it's related to the work that I've done in effort, too. If you think of, people use attention in colloquial ways, and then people use attention in scientific ways, and pay attention. You might tell a child, that's kind of like, try harder. And so those are a little bit different, and we've been trying to understand those differences.
So I know that is something you have specifically looked at, is that relationship between cognitive effort and working memory. So what have you seen in terms of how the cognitive effort that we put in, how that directly affects our working performance, our working memory performance? Yeah,
I mean, for years, researchers have speculated that just effort, just trying harder, might be mediating some of the differences that we have seen between individuals or even in the same person over the course of an experiment. And however, the concept of effort is kind of slippery. Like, scientists want a real concrete definition. When you start saying, okay, I'm going to study how you try harder, it gets to be a little dicey. So we finally decided to try to tackle this in a rigorous way. And so we set out to demonstrate that one has actually control over how good their working memory performance can be. That was our first thing we tried to demonstrate. If we can control our performance levels, then that's a starting point. So we started with using monetary incentives. So we would pay people if they were better.
Great incentive.
Yes, great incentive. Everybody likes that. We would also use like probabilistic cues. We would say, okay, I'm going to give you a hint. It's more likely I'm going to test you on this item versus that item in your memory. And so people pick up on these clues and they want to do well. And those probabilistic hints actually can push around the quality of working memory. Then we finally decided to put this thing to test and said, okay, we're going to tell people to try harder and ask whether it had an impact on working memory. And it did. And so the next thing we did was we tried to capitalize on this in an fMRI experiment. This work was done with one of my students, Sarah Master. In these studies, we were able to demonstrate that the reason trying harder improves your working memory performance was that the neural representations of the items that you're remembering got better. They were more precise and could be decoded from our brain imaging scans more accurately. Thus, trying harder actually has the impact of improving the quality of your working memory representations.
So was it that basically they were putting in more effort during the encoding phase? So when they're taking in the information, it was the extra effort at that time that helped them perform better when they're trying to recall the information?
We think it was both at the encoding. So you're told you're going to need to try hard on this trial because it's going to be hard. And we think that during the encoding was probably an important part, but also we had a long, like 12-second retention interval where the participant had to maintain these representations in mind, and there was no more visual stimulation. And we found that the effort effects were even during the maintenance period. So it's likely a combination of both the encoding and maintenance aspects of memory. Both of them probably improved.
So the prefrontal cortex is an area at the front of the brain, right behind our foreheads, and it's thought to be important for cognitive function. So we kind of touched on a little bit now, and also its role in working memory. Some of your work has challenged the textbook notion that working memory relies primarily on the prefrontal cortex. Can you tell us about that?
Right, and so in most textbooks, the dorsal lateral part of the prefrontal cortex is considered to be where working memory representations are stored. This is because of classic studies based on from the monkey brain, actually, the monkey prefrontal cortex, in which recordings from single neurons in the monkey prefrontal cortex showed this persistent activity. So after the stimulus that they were having to remember was taken away, they found that some neurons kept on firing. And they kept on firing throughout the entire retention interval, and then when they were able to make their memory response, it went away. So just the time course of that response kind of aligned with our notions of short-term memory or working memory. And some people described this persistent activity as like a mnemonic bridge that was over time linking a stimulus that disappeared with a later memory-guided response. And so the other aspect of that work was damage to this brain area, this part of the lateral prefrontal cortex in monkeys, caused impairments in working memory. So that's the basic textbook notion. Now, in our work, we find that the same area in the human brain, kind of a homologous area in the human brain, shows neither of those findings. So we find instead that a portion that's just a few centimeters back from that area shows both of those properties. So it shows beautiful persistent activity. It's stimulus selective, so whatever you have in memory is what it corresponds to. And we find that damage to that part of the prefrontal cortex causes damage to it worsens your memory. So you might think, well, okay, that's just a couple of centimeters, so what, right? But these couple of centimeters actually span a distance that two really different parts of the prefrontal cortex are implicated. So, however, all is not lost. This more posterior area that we have studied in humans in the monkey also shows those two features and actually stronger. So there's more evidence of persistent activity in this more posterior area, and the impact of lesions to this area causes even worse memory impairments than it does to the more anterior. So it kind of remains unknown why these differences between the two species exists. It's challenging because one, humans and monkeys are very different. Their brains look very different.
Especially the prefrontal cortex.
Yes,
prefrontal,
the prefrontal cortex is extremely different. The sulcus that they did most of these recordings and lesions in is called the principal sulcus, and there's no principal sulcus in the human. Mm-hmm. And so there's been debates for a long time among anatomists about what's the homologous area, and we kind of know now, but it has a history of controversy. I would say that the one thing that kind of mends the fence in this in these debates has been the idea that what the prefrontal cortex, this more anterior part, likely does is involved in not the storage part that we mentioned before, but more of the control operations. And we have several studies that are ongoing that we just presented at the Society for Neuroscience conference in Chicago that are trying to address these issues, and we think that's going to be the answer. So it's not like there's a big discrepancy. It's just that the interpretation of some of the data might be might need a little bit of revision. So stay tuned. We'll hopefully have some answers in the next year.
Yeah, we'll be on the lookout. So basically, just kind of to summarize that, the anterior part of the prefrontal cortex is now more believed to be involved in the control of this working memory, not storing these representations of working memory.
I would say not everyone believes that. I'd say it's a big open question. I kind of think that's probably how this is all going to get sorted out. But, I think we're going to need a lot more research to resolve this controversy.
So you kind of touched on it, but so where's the storage happening then? It's that visual cortex, the incoming information, that it's holding on to this information for a little bit before the prefrontal cortex controls what's happening.
Or like an interaction. So,
right.
For example, we have just a large portion of the back of our brain that's devoted to processing visual information. It allows us to see everything that we can see, recognize everything we can recognize. And if you were to posit that in the lateral prefrontal cortex, that the neurons there are actually storing all these visual features, then you would have to duplicate all of that machinery in the frontal cortex, and that just seems very inefficient to begin with. And so what is my prediction is going to come out of all of this research is that the activity that people are characterizing in the lateral prefrontal cortex is more likely to be involved in these control signals, or people refer to them as top-down. If you think of a hierarchy of a boss, like a boss is telling another worker what to do. And so the visual cortex might be the worker who has the ability to encode these visual features, and the boss of the prefrontal cortex telling the worker whether to remember this or that or drop everything, so kind of like a controller.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of makes sense because it is, a lot of people refer to the prefrontal cortex as the brain's executive command center,
Exactly.
right? And generally speaking as well. So how does the development of the prefrontal cortex throughout childhood and adolescence relate to the maturation of cognitive abilities? I mean, I think most people anecdotally know that they say it doesn't fully develop till you're 25,
Yeah.
something like that. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's really fascinating. As the prefrontal cortex matures from childhood to adolescence into like adult-like levels, working memory also matures during that same period. And in fact, when you get to adult-like levels of working memory, those kind of coincide with when the PFC is fully matured in your early 20s. So it's tempting to speculate because of this correspondence that they're causally related, but I don't know yet because it's a hard thing to actually get traction on data-wise. Like you would have to do, first of all, very careful longitudinal studies for a long period of time. And I think people are working on that, but right now it just seems like, yeah, that's probably it. I mean, given the time courses that they mature together, it's likely that that's because of the maturation.
But I mean, it's interesting when you think about it because in terms of memory capacity, working memory capacity, you think of younger, maybe not children, but at least adolescents as having probably a higher capacity than even maybe some adults. But in actual fact, it's maybe the control aspect you're talking about that is still maturing, or is it the whole capacity?
Like holding the information and
Yeah.
manipulation, or is it just,
Yeah, well, I think both. Like, so for one, when we talk about capacity in the context of working memory, we're talking about the short-term storage component of that. And I don't think children or adolescents have bigger capacities than adults. The capacity that we're talking about them as being like a memory sponge. They can just learn everything really quickly. That's like learning. Their learning capacity is like amazing.
Yeah, because they were going into like long-term memory as well.
Yeah.
We're not talking about just short-term at that point.
Knowledge generation through learning,
Yeah.
yes. So in working memory, it's not necessarily the same thing, but what they do, they are learning to learn, and that part of the learning to learn during that adolescent period seems to map onto the other thing that you said, which is that kids start to learn how to better control their controller. And adults are already really good at it, but kids are learning to kind of master that controller such that they can better allocate their memory resources, filter out distraction, use all the things that help our short-term memory. For example, we rehearse things. So when you're trying to remember a phone number or like a code that you have to use to verify your identity, you're kind of rehearsing those numbers in your mind's ear, I guess what it is. And I think they learn how to do those things, and those are associated with our control processes.
So we've been talking about the prefrontal cortex. What about the parietal cortex? Where is this region, and what is its role in our cognitive abilities?
Right, that's a great question. In many ways, the prefrontal cortex and this posterior part of the parietal cortex are very similar. In fact, one of my classes I teach, I show neurons, the examples of neurons firing from parietal cortex and frontal cortex during these simple working memory tasks, and they're essentially indistinguishable. And that's one of the ways I kind of demonstrate to my class that, hey, prefrontal cortex is not special here with working memory. And that's true. They both show clear working memory-related activity, especially this more posterior part of the prefrontal cortex that I was referring to before. That looks very, very similar to parietal cortex. I wasted a number of years in the 2000s trying really, really hard to figure out what are the differences. I was trying to unlock this key. Okay, they got to be different somehow. And the kind of take-home of those lost years of my life, it appears that they work together to support working memory. And there are slight differences. So, for example, the prefrontal cortex, which is right next to motor cortex, so it's just anterior to primary motor and premotor cortex, tends to show activity that's driven more towards goal-directed behavior. So when you think of like you're using your memory to do something, it's really like that kind of internal goal-directed action, using your memory for that. The posterior parietal cortex, on the other hand, tends to be a little bit more biased towards incoming perceptual representations. And so you can kind of conceptualize their differences in terms of this kind of internal versus external focus. But the problem that makes it so difficult to study, and this is, I'm not sure about this, but this is what I think based on looking at a lot of animal data too, where they have very fast, high temporal resolution of the signals that they can measure. The problem, I think, is that as soon as one area knows something, let's say the prefrontal cortex, this posterior part of the prefrontal cortex, knows that, okay, there's something over here I'm remembering because of an internal goal. Parietal cortex knows it quickly. There's a giant white matter tract that connects them, and they are kept in sync. There's very few situations where they can get out of sync. And so same thing with the parietal cortex. As soon as some new sensory information comes in, it gets fast, rapid transmission of information from visual cortex. As soon as it gets that information, it's something like, hey, something's sparkling over to my left. I should attend to it. It's immediately, we're talking about tens of milliseconds. Immediately, it feeds those signals forward to this posterior part of the prefrontal cortex, and it knows. So they stay in such close registry, even though they may begin or get their information from different sources, they stay in lock step with one another. So it's very challenging to dissociate them, especially in the context of working memory. We're talking about the extended durations. So,
Yeah.
So I was really fascinated to learn that activity in those frontal and parietal areas of the brain are thought to relate to maps of what you call prioritized space. So could you tell us more about that? What exactly is prioritized space? And then those maps, how are they different to, say, the types of spatial maps that are formed in the hippocampus?
yeah. So let's start with what a map is. So in primary visual cortex, we have the clearest evidence, and we've known for a really long time, that there are maps. And these maps are parts of tissue. So if you think of the cortical surface of primary visual cortex as being like a extended piece of real estate, cortical real estate, if you look at the structure of that real estate, it tends to be laid out like our retina, or it's laid out like our visual world. So when I look at you, your head is above your hands. The mic is to your left, and etc. So in the map of my primary visual cortex, that spatial topography, those relationships, would also be preserved. So you can imagine yourself. Actually, you get flipped upside
you get
down,
flipped.
and you would be in my visual cortex. And so that's what I mean by a map. It's topological, just like a map of a city is topological. There's north, south, east, west. Something in one part of the map right next to it is closer than something really far away in the map. And we knew about these maps in early visual cortex for a long time. There's many of them in early visual cortex. But what we were surprised to find, I guess now it's over 10 years ago, when we changed slightly the ways in which you estimate these maps in subjects using fMRI, we found that these maps exist all over the parietal cortex, and there's several in the frontal cortex. And we were able to really see them when we, instead of just using visual stimulation to identify these maps, we started having people do cognitive tasks at different spatial positions in the visual field, and then they revealed themselves, and it was very exciting. So why do we call them priority maps? Well, one, they're not simple like early visual cortex. You could be unconscious. If you were unconscious and I propped your eye open and put you in an fMRI scanner, and I played a video screen of some flashing checkerboards moving across your retina, I could map V1. You would not be able to map parietal or frontal cortex. In fact, what I just said, you can't even map frontal and parietal cortex without some cognitive operation that's sweeping across space. So it's not vision that's sweeping across space. It's a cognitive operation that's sweeping across space, like attention or working memory. And so what does this have to do with priority? So one way to think about it, I think you've probably seen movies in which people use night vision goggles. And like some action movie. Well, when they show that, it usually is like some kind of false color. It looks kind of like maybe yellowish, where there's someone hiding or something like that, right? You've seen this. Those work by mapping heat. So they're taking the temperature in the visual scene and converting them into a color map that is basically heat. So we think of that as an analogy for these priority maps. So the heat in the priority map relates to the behavioral relevance of that part of visual space. So my coffee cup is right here on the table, and I drink a lot of coffee. I like coffee. So I might have in one of these priority maps the neurons that have receptive fields that cover this part of space. They may be firing a little bit more than other parts of space, probably where you are, and my coffee, where the mic is. Those are the important things in my environment right now. So you could imagine if those were heat, they would make that image on the night goggles as being kind of yellow in these spots. So now let's think about what would that mean in a priority map. It's not the visual information, because in these priority maps, it's kind of agnostic about what it is that you're looking at. So the priority map might not know that this is a coffee cup. It doesn't represent any of the visual features of this coffee cup. It just knows that there's value there. There's some kind of significance there. And so if you think about, well, why would those be useful in frontal and parietal cortex? Well, imagine let's go back to the idea of I'm attending to this doorway where I'm expecting my friend to come in. Well, if you had a map of space that has a lot of heat at that location, that may be why you're able to attend there. And if your visual system's reading out from that priority map where there's heat, then the neurons that have receptive fields that cover that location are going to be a little bit more active. And so you'll be quicker to identify your friend when they come through the doorway. That's a classic example of the effect of attention. And so you could imagine in working memory as well, if you're remembering something, like where, I'm not looking at my coffee cup, I can remember where it is, it might be because there's activity in the neurons that have receptive fields that they're telling me there's something important there. So if those are persistent over time, that's a mechanism of memory. So I could go on and on about it, but that's basically how we think about these priority maps. They're useful for lots of cognitive operations.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Amber and I were kind of talking before this on maybe the evolutionary perspective of that, where, primates, you're in a tree on a branch, so you have to prioritize that fruit that you're reaching for, right? So that can kind of translate to, your coffee mug right now, you're prioritizing that, so that will allow you to reach for it and so on, and ignore the other distractors.
And the information about what makes something prioritized is so individualized. So, for example, if you and a monkey were sitting, I don't know, on a park bench, and you look over and there's a bag that has a money sign on it, money symbol on it, dollar sign. The monkey's like, I don't know what that is, but you would be like, all right, that's money. Yeah. That's something So even semantic knowledge is thought to be able to drive prioritization.
So the areas that we were just discussing, the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortices, which are crucial control mechanisms, those are involved in executive control, and there are many neurological and psychiatric disorders which actually stem from a dysfunction of executive control. So things like schizophrenia, ADHD, substance abuse disorders, and also neurological conditions like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. Mm-hmm. So how do your studies on the prefrontal cortex and spatial cognition contribute to our understanding of brain health and also potential treatments for cognitive disorders? Yeah,
that's so fascinating. And one of the reasons one of the reasons I got into working memory research was because of one of the things you mentioned. Working memory as a cognitive measure was very predictive of genetic risk for schizophrenia. And in fact, even in examples like thought disorder and delusions that people who have suffered from schizophrenia have, some people think even those symptoms might actually be primary impairments in working memory, and those primary impairments in working memory cascade into these different other symptoms. So imagine if you had a problem with working memory right now, you might not be understanding perfectly what I'm saying, which could lead to some confusion. Or if you're trying to organize your thoughts so you can speak, if you're not able to maintain in working memory your train of thought, then you might have some disorder in your thought and speech. So that's what kind of got me into this, and I think it's a particularly interesting phenomenon because of things like that. So also individual differences in working memory ability, not only with clinical features, but they are correlated with almost all of our cognitive abilities, including IQ. Generalized intelligence is measured in typical batteries. Mm-hmm. Is highly correlated with working memory. Reading comprehension is highly correlated with working memory. Even your academic achievement in college is correlated. Someone told me that because of that and a couple of things, the amount of money you'll make in your lifetime is correlated with your working memory abilities. Let's hope not. But yes, with the psychiatric and neurological diseases, I think it's a particularly useful way to assess both risk for disorders potentially, but also measure how someone is doing on a day-to-day basis. So the other thing I would say, I think you're alluding to with brain health is because it's so correlated and predictive of all these things that make our lives better and our cognitive abilities better and more stable, might it be a way to maybe provide some type of remediation or protection from like things like the changes in your brain when you age and your memory changes when you age. And that is really fascinating. There's a lot of work that's been done on, for example, trying to train working memory abilities by doing like an hour a day for months, doing working memory tasks over and over again. And what we find when people do that is, on the one hand, not that so surprising. So you get better at those tasks. So when anything you practice, you get better at it, right? Pretty much. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is, does practicing on working memory actually start to improve these other cognitive abilities that they're correlated with? And the answer to that is kind of mixed. And there's some of it's optimistic and some of it's not so optimistic. So the optimistic thing is that there seems to be a little bit of generalizability. So when you train on basic working memory, yes, you get a little bit better at other cognitive abilities. However, the reach is kind of driven by how close that cognitive ability is to the way you did the working memory training. So you can imagine in the examples I talked about with spatial attention, spatial working, those are very closely related to one. They may even be mechanistically related. Those show a lot of transfer, and the transfer effects can last a long time. However, once you start getting into other cognitive abilities that may be further away, like reading comprehension, then the results are more mixed. Some studies finding some generalization, some studies not. So it's a little bit of an open question. I think one of the big issues, and again, this is not my main area of research, but I follow it because I'm hoping that this could be something really, really impactful. It could help improve people's cognitive abilities. But the one thing that's a little bit problematic in my mind is the type of training they do. Most often the training is done basic short-term memory. So without we talked about this whole storage versus control. A lot of it is very geared towards storage. And and then the generalization to other things is not. So even generalization to another working memory task that really emphasizes the control component. So let me think of an example. If I gave you maybe 5 or 6 letters to remember, and then I asked you to repeat those back to me after 10 seconds or so, that's a classic kind of working memory storage test. If you train someone on that a lot, and then you had to do the following, where okay, I'm going to give you those letters again, and you have to alphabetize them in your mind. The transfer would not be as strong, so you would benefit much more from the standard storage part where you don't have to alphabetize than you would be with alphabetize. But the thing for me is, well, if people started to do training using the more complicated control operations, we think these control operations are not just specific to working memory.
Right.
We think they have to do with a lot of other abilities. And so I think the next steps might be to try to train more using those control strategies and see if that actually generalizes better. So it would be really fantastic, and it's we have some hope that that working memory training could improve more general cognitive abilities, and it's being applied in a lot of domains right now. I mentioned age-related changes in memory. It's being used in a lot of studies right now, but also ADHD. There's I looked at a meta-analysis, and there had to be, dozens of studies that have been completed, and I know there's another dozen that are going on right now. So there's hope.
It's a big area
Yes.
of research right now.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So are most of these like cognitive training type things or working memory training, I mean, what is their impact in the long term? Is, let's say you did 6 months of training, would that mean you'd have the improvement for a short period of time after that? Because I'm assuming you probably have to keep training.
Yeah, if you stop, like
Yeah.
the improvement is
I
no
don't.
longer
That's a good question. I don't really know the answer, but what I do know is that when you do stop, the effects are short term. Like depending on what if it's like if you're trying to generalize to almost the same task, it's longer lasting, but it still shows decline. So I think you're right. You would probably have to top up every now and then.
Yeah.
So what are you most excited about for the future of this research?
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing I'm excited about is our growing ability to connect behaviors like working memory that we can measure in humans down to the ways in which neurons or population of neurons might be supporting these behaviors. If you think about that gap, that's a big gap. I mean, the electrical activity of a few 100,000 neurons in a small little cube, like 1 millimeter cube of brain. Trying to connect that to something like working memory seems daunting, but every year we're getting closer and closer and closer to that. And I think this ambitious project that we're trying to do, which is reverse engineer the brain, is getting more traction because of computational aspects of neuroscience. If there's students out there, take as many math and computational coding analytics classes that you can take, because when you go on the job market, that's what everybody's wanting now.
It's a big thing now in neuroscience.
Yes.
Amber and I know. It's
Yes. So these computational approaches involve both theory, so you can simulate what a network of neurons is doing. And if you have some researchers that are taking those neural networks and comparing them to the activity of real neurons, like in animal studies, that's a bridge now from the neuron to the model. And then in humans, if you're using similar models, that becomes the bridge from the fMRI measurements you can make and connect to that model, and then the behavior. And so it's a basic. I'm excited that the computational approaches are allowing us to better connect these low-level neural mechanisms with the high-level cognitive behaviors. And I would not have thought that possible, 15 years ago, say.
Right.
So
Wow.
I'm excited about that.
Good time to be doing neuroscience.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Where can our listeners learn more about your research?
Well, you can go to my webpage. It's clayspacalab.com. There's a little pun there. Clayspace is a pun on K-space, which for the, yes, you just said, for the MRI junkies, it means the way that we make our measurements is in frequency domain, and so we have to transfer that from the frequency domain into the 3D space Cartesian domain. And it also has a kind of a double punny effect. I study space, so it's kind of Clay Space Lab. Yeah, I don't know. It's terrible. But thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Dr. Curtis, thank you again for sharing your expertise with us today and for the incredible work you're doing to understand the neural mechanisms underlying spatial cognition. We look forward to hearing about your future research.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the CVL podcast. You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts or look for episodes on our website, where you can also learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity. Just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research, as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.